I'm currently running a bit of a custody theme on the podcast, and I decided to also do this on the academy side of things and talk about how I believe that a public key infrastructure will impact the world of financial services, and there in particular the world of custody, because I do think this is where the biggest impact will be. So my key hypothesis here is that public key infrastructure will ultimately lead to a vertical breakup of the entire financial services value chain, and especially for fund management and custody. So what I mean is mostly two things. On the custody thing, I think it will remove economies of scale. So instead of having a few large custodians, you have many more smaller custodians. And on the fund management side, I think that we will see much fewer custodians that are directly to the funds, but it's more that fund managers will either tell customers what to buy and then they buy it themselves and self-custody it, or there might be discretionary portfolio management, but ultimately the custody will be either self-custody by the customer or held with the custodian of the customer's choice, as opposed to a custodian attached to the fund. So customers will be direct customers as custodians as opposed to indirect customers via fund managers. So when I say breaking down the financial services chain or breaking it up, we need to look at the financial services chain. Now it is very the value chain. It is an interesting value chain in the sense that it has two customers and the value chain really connecting those two. So the two customers are on the one hand the investors and on the other hand the issuers, and the financial services connect those two. So starting from the investor side, I distinguished here between investment advisors who do not have discretionary portfolio management authority and fund managers who have discretionary authority. Then there are markets. Markets connect buyers and sellers, and it can be either primary or secondary. So primary connects issuers to investors, while secondary markets connect two investors to each other. Once investors or once two people who want to transact have found each other and agreed, they need a clearing house to actually settle the deal, which generally means the securities move one way and the cash moves the other way. And then the last part, what you need is custodian and depository. The custodian deals with the security portfolio on behalf of the investor, and the depository deals with the security portfolio on behalf of the issuer. So it's mostly different reporting, but it's very important that they are strongly connected because essentially they're looking at the same database, just from different sides. At the moment, the main entry point for retail customers are fund managers. So they really front everyone else in the system, including issuers. Possibly investment advisors assist them, or investment advisors give a high level view, but ultimately the real entry point are fund managers. Why is this the case? Two reasons. The first is a cognitive load. The cognitive load on the investor side. If you want to run a diversified portfolio, even if you do this as a full-time job, it really taxes your time. It's just if you need to follow 100, 200, 500 investments, there are just simply not enough hours in the day to do that. And this is for a full-time job. If you're having actually another day job, there's absolutely no way that you can do this. Now, the question is, why do you need the current fund management model? Why can't you run more of an advisory model or even a robo-advisory model to do this? And there, the second point is the custody thing. Because at the moment, the only way that you can economically viably custody assets is if you attach the custody to the fund manager. So every investor in a certain fund gets exactly the same portfolio, and the same portfolio is then custodied by a custodian that attaches to the fund manager, and that then sends out the whatever reports go to their end investors, or rather the fund custodians of the end investors. So how do private keys change that? Well, we need to talk about how private keys are different from symmetric keys. Now, A symmetric key is a shared secret between every pair of two interacting participants. And when we're talking about symmetric keys and the shared secret thing, what I want to stress is everything like username and password is effectively a symmetric key. It's a shared secret. Yeah. In order to identify secure communication amongst two people, they somehow need to say, "Is okay. This is how we identify each other," and they do this by means of a shared secret. But so this means every pair needs to establish this. So if you have n participants, you need n square. You have n square communication channels, or rather half n square, but it's a big number. If you have a public key infrastructure in place, on the other hand, there is one single key per participant. It is closely tied to their identity. So everyone has just a single key, and the public key is literally that. It is public knowledge, and everyone who communicates with this one participant simply uses their public key, and they always use the same private key, both for identification and for actually encryption. Now, on the symmetric key side, when you deal with multiple people, for example, when your custodian has to deal with a depository, then essentially you require either bilateral relationships or more often a forwarding of trust. So essentially, the depository needs to trust the custodian that they really deal with you as the end customer, because they have no way of independently verifying it, or they need to engage in a bilateral relationship with you themselves, in which case, again, they need to establish shared secrets. When you have a public key infrastructure, you do not need this delegation of trust, because every participant can independently verify authenticity. A depository that has never seen you can literally still look at the messages signed by you and see, well, they have been signed by you or they have not been signed by you, because they literally just have to verify them against your public key. So what this means is just a massive reduction in complexity. Imagine we have 100 countries, so one investor per country, one custodian per investor, and we have also 100 issuer countries. So that every investor can invest in every country, we need 10,000 connections, or rather, we need 5,000 connections, but this is 10,000 if you think about them each way. With public key infrastructure, we massively cut down these numbers, because suddenly we only have 100 keys on the investor side and 100 keys on the issuer side. So instead of 10,000 connections or 10,000 shared secrets, we suddenly only need 200. More generally, we have a problem that is n times n, say n investors and m issuers, or n custodians and m depositories, goes to an n plus m problem. And obviously, it is very easy to see if n and m are big numbers, this is just a massive reduction in complexity. Just think about, even if it's just 1,000 investors and 1,000 projects, 1,000 issuers, then you have 500,000, so a million or 500,000 of bilateral connections, whilst n plus m is only 2,000. Yeah, so this 2,000 is obviously much more manageable than a million. And once you get to a million investors, things just become completely unmanageable, unless you have some intermediate pooling via pooled investments, via fund managers, via these big custodians that sit in the middle. So the conclusion here is, or one conclusion here is, symmetric keys lead to massive economies of scale and network effect in the custody space. So you have like everything industrial organized, like our Heineken beers on the left. And a public key infrastructure, on the other hand, allows for artisanal custodians. So craft beer, everyone can do their own custodian. You can even be your self-custodian. Ultimately, with a public key infrastructure, you can even custody your assets yourself, or your dad can custody your assets, or more likely, actually, the son is going to custody the assets for the father, and so you can have big proliferation of custody providers. And once you have this artisanal custody in place, there's also no need for managers to run massive homogeneous portfolios, because this need was driven by the ability to custody them. You just couldn't run a different custodial portfolio for every investor. And so this means they can operate under a robo-advisory model. But anyway, this is for another day. I want to custody. I want to focus on the custody side here. So the conclusion: when we have public key infrastructure, the complexity goes from an n times n complexity to an n plus m complexity. And this allows for especially a massive increase in the number of custodians n, and also a massive increase of the number of issuers m if you want. You can get rid of these aggregating intermediaries like depositories, like custodians, so they can be much more granular. This is particularly important in a cross-border setting, because depositories often do not operate cross-border, so large M. And this allows retail investors for pretty interesting cross-border investment opportunities that nowadays are just simply not possible, because it is not beneficial for a custodian in Estonia to establish relationship with a depository in Uganda. Yeah. So when you have public key infrastructure in space, because there's no forwarding of trust needed, you don't need this, and you can do cross-border investment much easier. Obviously, regulations is still a problem. We have to deal with those, but at least the technical complexities are solved. And the third conclusion was, because you can now custody more granular portfolios, so portfolios for even a single investor, this allows you to move from a pooled investment model, where one fund manager runs a fund and everyone invests into the same fund, to more of a robo investment advisory model. Why robo? Well, because obviously the complexity in advising a lot of people also means that, well, you go onto the cognitive load of the investment advisors. So this somehow needs to be automated. Anyway, but this latter point is really part of another discussion that I'm going to have. That's all for today. I hope you enjoyed it. And well, I hope to see you soon, and I hope you subscribe to my podcast. Bye.